So thank you all for joining us today. I hope has this been a good conference? Yeah, gotten a lot of good stuff out of it? Well, good. Well, I've met quite a few of you here, and I appreciate your coming to hear this session. We're going to be talking about Lync in the contact center, understand the different offerings that are in the marketplace. My name's Don Van Doren. I wear two hats. I'm here registered as Unicom Consulting. Unicom is a independent consulting firm that Marty Parker and I started back in 2007 to basically help organizations understand how to move from legacy communications capabilities into what's coming next, some of the new changes that are really dramatically influencing the way this industry works. But my other hat is Vanguard Communications, and Vanguard is a independent consulting firm that I founded 30-some years ago. And for the last 2 decades, all of our work has really been in customer interaction strategy. How do companies interact with their customers, with their partners? And so contact centers are a big part of that activity. I was actually involved with my Vanguard hat on with Microsoft early days when they were trying to figure out what do they do about this whole market and where do they go with it and how they're progressing. So this has been a subject that's long been near and dear to my heart. I'm delighted to be here and talking with you about all this today. Our goal, the takeaways from this session, are really to look at some of the overall trends. One way to have done this session, by the way, is to dive into all 36 partner companies of Microsoft and look at all their different products and all the different capabilities that they have. And I frankly decided that's not the best way to do it. The problem is that it changes all the time. There's a lot of things going on with new updates. And so I'm basically going to focus today on what are some of the key issues and trends that we see in contact centers, and then abstract from that and say, therefore, what are some of the key things that you as customers may need to look at and want to watch for and see how to take advantage of, and what's going to be important as you're looking forward to designing a strategy. To the extent you're a systems integrator, what I'm looking at is how are some of the trends that are going on in this marketplace really influencing how you should be coming to market with products and capabilities to build on top of the Lync platform that exists. What we are going to do is have 4 representatives from the industry, from the partners, who are going to be here talking very briefly about their solutions, but more generically in terms of their particular approach to how they've gone about integrating into the Lync platform and what that means in terms of functionality and capabilities and so what are the different ways that this can be accomplished. So that's really our goal today. Let me just, to get started, ask how many of you are end users, companies that buy these systems to put them in place? We have a couple of you. Okay. All the rest of you take their names. Okay. Who are systems integrators in the room? Okay. Great. Quite a few of you. And who are the rest of you? No, never mind. We have a consultant, one consultant. By the way, this is Marty Parker. Marty is my partner in Unicom Consulting, and really one of the best thought leaders in this whole industry, in my opinion. I'm just absolutely delighted to have an opportunity to work with him. So, okay, let's get going, and we'll look at, finally, just to wrap up this thing, what I'm going to go to is some of the things we've learned over the years from our consulting practice that really governs how companies make decisions about how to move forward with their contact center environment. So that's our goal today. First thing I'd like to talk about is, just sort of the thing that Gurdeep talked about a lot 2 days ago. We're undergoing a fundamental shift in the way communications works, and especially voice communications, of course, which is near and dear to the hearts of most people looking at contact center issues. Standalone voice as a concept is disappearing. PBXs are a dying breed in some sense. They're going to be around for a long time, but their role is significantly diminished, and I think that's a very important issue. Mobility has siphoned off a lot of traffic. Peer-to-peer communications, of course, is taking a great chunk of it. And the other piece that we find, Marty and I find in our consulting work that's especially important is how are we taking communications and building it right into the applications, into the software applications, into the business processes that your companies have. Because that's the thing that's really making a difference, I think, in where all this is going. Obviously, there are new devices, mobility, explosion of new kinds of capabilities that are just causing things to change dramatically. This has an impact on how contact centers work. Not because people are calling you from a mobile phone, but because of the fact that smartphones now have the capability to interact with your business in a new way that's really crucial. And it's going to change the way these communications between companies and their customers are going to work. And finally, just a lot of new methods of communications, new kinds of channels. Obviously, social media is one big example where we're just seeing an explosion of new kinds of ways for communications. And all this means that really it's changing how customer interactions work, but it also has enormous implications for what the contact center is. And I think the other piece that I'd like to just say on top of this is what I've seen here at this show is really enlightening. And what's enlightening about it is the fact that it's becoming very clear that the pieces are now coming together to where we're starting to build platforms for communications. And Microsoft is doing an excellent job of this. They're not the only one, obviously. IBM is doing this. Google's doing this. Salesforce.com is doing this. There are a number of companies that are starting to build platforms on which a number of different applications are going to run. I think this is really the new model for how a lot of this is going to happen in the future. And a lot of things have come together at this show to just really enlighten how that process is likely to work. And contact centers, I think, are one excellent example of this. I mean, if you go onto the Microsoft pages, there's something like 36 different companies now that are building solutions that work on top of this. And we're going to talk about that today and what some of the implications are. Okay, so this chart basically sort of looks at the overall contact center environment and the solutions, the different kinds of things we can do. Over on the left side, basically, we're building on top of sort of standard PBX features. As we go over to the right, we get more into dedicated high-scale ACD capabilities. In the middle, we've got some sort of standard features. The middle row is sort of, what kinds of capabilities are available in each of these. And then the bottom is sort of where do these fit into a particular environment, from large call centers on the one hand down to just departmental solutions. And the point is that we've got answers for all of these things. And we're going to be talking about some of those and discussing different ways of approaching that market. Okay, so I'm going to now start going through some of the features and functions and directional changes that we're seeing in the contact center industry. So we're getting beyond the contact center original goal of how do you queue calls, how do you route them, and how do you report about those calls and how they're handled within your organization. This was the original goal of ACDs when they were first burst onto the marketplace in 1973. That was the year, by the way. Rockwell, was asked by Continental Airlines to figure out a new way to how do we handle all these incoming phone calls in a much more effective way. And so they built the first Galaxy system to do this. They're actually still represented sort of in the room because Aspect bought Rockwell, and we have Aspect right here with us today, and Livio's going to be talking a little bit about not talking about that, but I'm sorry. Yeah, I know, but you're taking the place. Anyway, so what we're starting to see now is a bunch of changes in this whole area. So moving from in queue treatments, all of these new kinds of capabilities. I mean, obviously music has been there for a long time, but we're starting to get tailored announcements based on who the particular caller is, to the extent that we can identify that and bring out some of these capabilities. Where are we in queue? Expected wait time. These are features that may or may not be important in a particular end user customer's environment. Advanced routing capabilities. We're starting to move beyond sort of the most idle agent, which is a very common way that people originally started thinking about this, and moving into other kinds of routing schemes. What we're seeing in terms of the vendors that are providing solutions on top of the Microsoft platform are a whole range of these things. Some of them are very basic, others are much more sophisticated in terms of what they can do. From an end user customer standpoint, the question is, what's required? How much more do you need? And I think that those of you that are building these capabilities need to understand what the customers are trying to do. One of the big changes we're seeing in the market is that there's a lot more interest in organizations really trying to marry up a specific agent to a particular caller that's out there. And some of this is starting to get really sophisticated. So, for example, there's now a company out here that's doing profiling of customers in terms of their sort of emotional profile and what kind of agents they would most want to talk about. There's some very interesting things going on. I'm not saying that all of you who are building these systems need to worry about that one quite yet, but the point is that we're starting to really change how we mine big data information in order to use this for doing better routing capabilities. Finally, reporting. Reporting always seems to be the stepchild of any of these solutions. It's sort of the last thing that gets done, and yet what we're still finding in most of our end user client experiences is that this is something that's really crucial. And so most companies have some sort of canned reports along with an accessible database to allow them to build customized reports of various kinds. Analytics is becoming a really crucial issue. I'm going to come back and talk a little bit more about that one a little bit later. Another big change area is how do companies contact you, or how do customers contact you? Voice has been an important one. It remains one. We'll take a look at that on the next chart. But increasingly, email is becoming a very important channel for this. But as we move forward, we're going to see a lot more of web chat, screen sharing maybe on top of this. I think some of the developments that we're seeing in the industry to put buttons on websites to allow people to initiate either callbacks or some kind of immediate chat capability. This is becoming a very important feature for many companies. Video. People are looking at video, and do we do video call centers in some sense? We're seeing some very good applications for these, typically in pretty narrow ranges today. So situations where you've got a retail store, for example, and you've got you're doing electronics or high fidelity sound equipment or something. So you need some fairly technical specialist, and the kid that's working the store floor may not be that kind of a person. So setting up a video kiosk where customers can go and then interact with somebody that really understands the technical depth of these things can work. Banking, another good example. Out in a retail branch office, you may not have all the specialists that you need. So setting up a kiosk that can go back and work with a video specialist. So over video, a specialist who understands something about loan applications, for instance, or mortgage rates. So we're seeing a lot of interest in that. Social media, again, I mentioned, is becoming a huge deal. People are trying to still figure out, what do we do with this? Do we just monitor what's going out in the blogosphere and in the social media world, or do we actually interact with customers? Do we take feeds off of Facebook or Twitter and send them to call center agents and have them work it out? We're still struggling with that. There's a specialized training. The people that do that have to understand a little bit more about how to interact best with customers. But those of you that are developing systems need to start thinking about how do we migrate some of these kinds of capabilities into our solutions. And then finally, mobile app support. I think personally this is going to be a huge issue going forward. As we get more and more smartphones out here, we have a couple of capabilities that are important. This isn't just a question of somebody, as I said before, calling in on your mobile phone into a call center. It's interacting with systems, you know, visual IVR, for example. How do you put a visual menu on somebody's smartphone? Or then if they want to leave that IVR solution, how do we transfer that over into a customer environment where they can get a hold of the contact center, talk to an agent, but most importantly, transmit the information from the smartphone right to that agent so that they have that information. The good thing about the smartphone is that there's some authentication capabilities that are built into the fact that somebody's got this smartphone with them. And so this really can speed up and change how the interaction works. But those of you that are designing systems need to take that into account as you're building the way these interfaces are working. So where are we on multiple channels? This is a chart that came out about 6 months ago, and it's quite astonishing to me that something like 75% or 70% of the contacts are still over the telephone. And I don't know, we may have a chicken and egg problem here in that call centers have been set up to handle calls. And so we're starting to see features for some other things. I'll get to that on the next chart, but we're starting to see how some of this is shifting. But what's fascinating is that we still have an awful lot of people working on just telephone calls as the method of communications. Email is large and growing. Some self-service is in here. I'm not sure, by the way, what question they asked to get this, because we find that this number is very variable based on the industry and the particular kinds of applications that you're seeing. But anyway, the point is, clearly you need to solve the telephone problem, but there's more. Go ahead.
It's also interesting that written letters are more popular than social media.
Well, in this chart it was, and I'd like to find out more about who they asked and what that question was.
Self-service at the IVR?
Yes. Well, and web too. Oh, well, I'm sorry, telephony self-service is IVR. Yeah, and that's frankly a small number. But it depends so much on the industry and what the application is. So, yeah.
You know, we're talking about telephony here. Is there any knowledge or understanding of the split between people using, let's say, a home phone, a work phone versus a mobile device? Because that's significantly different.
Yes, it is. Yeah. By the way, just the question was, is there any statistics that we've got looking at where people call from? Work, phone, you know, home phone, landline, or else a mobile phone. And obviously we're seeing some pretty dramatic shifts in how that goes. and what it brings, frankly, is new capabilities that I think developers need to start building into their businesses as they do it. So, you know, where are we in, this is a chart that was done, by the way, it wasn't done by an Emeritus in 3012. This chart is not accurate for 3012. I can guarantee you that. But the point is, this just shows sort of intentions as of a year and a half ago about where people are in this, what they're currently doing in terms of email and web chat, and where they're planning to go. So it's growing. It's a growing area that people are starting to spend more time thinking about. So you that are developing solutions, I think, clearly need to build these kinds of capabilities into your environment. Okay, some other things. Workforce management, obviously that's been around a long time. Whether or not it's the kind of thing that you need to build into your system or not, it sort of depends on the market that you're going after, because most SMBs are still using Excel spreadsheets or some kind of spreadsheet technology to do this, planning for how their workforce is scheduled. But what we're starting to see is that there's some very interesting lower-end standalone systems that are coming in to provide some very interesting capabilities. What I find really interesting is how this ties into some of the other solutions that we're seeing. Let me get to that in a second. Call call recording, you know, there are two kinds. Basically, you're logging all calls for archival purposes or compliance purposes, or else you're recording selected calls for quality monitoring purposes. Similar technologies, quite a different application in terms of how they're done and deployed. And then another thing on training, and I'm going to tie all these together because what we're starting to see happen, and one of the trends that I think is going to be really interesting, is situations where a quality monitoring system is monitoring an agent's work, and then based on that saying, this agent that seems to have a pattern of not being able to handle this particular type of call very effectively. And therefore, what we need to do is get some kind of training capability in place. And one of the training things that we're seeing is, you know, just-in-time training programs so that an individual can be sitting at their desk. If they've got some idle time, they can call up a particular training video and actually do some training right then. And as I say, we're starting to see all these working together so that the quality monitoring system says, hey, this guy needs help in this area. The workforce management system is then notified, and the workforce management system is basically saying, how do we schedule this person so that they can get that training and then make all of this happen together. So we're starting to see these capabilities merge. So again, as those of you that are designing systems, I think need to be thinking about how far do we want to go in that particular area. Some of the companies have gone a long way that are working with Microsoft right now. Others have not even started thinking about this kind of a functionality. Agent desktop's a key issue. You know, how do we design something? Real estate is always a factor, so having some sort of a crawl down around the lower part of your screen may be an important capability to add certain information about queue lengths and what's going on within the center so that the agents know how to handle calls. They can adjust sort of the speed at which they're doing things, how much they're reaching out to customers for new things, or how much they have to just get off the phone to get working on the queue. So these kinds of things can be really critical from an operational standpoint inside the center. And finally, performance optimization. This is something that I think people are really starting to understand that it makes sense to pay attention to. And there are lots of metrics and lots of things that people look at. One of the things that I wanted to just comment a little bit about really represents, I think, a subtle shift in thinking. And it has to do with how do our customers feel about the interaction that they're having with our company? Because we're starting to see some shifts in this. 10 years ago, everybody was talking about customer satisfaction and how do we measure this and what's the right answer. What we've learned is that a satisfied customer is not all that valuable to a company. It's nice to be satisfied, that's a good thing, but it doesn't really guarantee that you're going to repurchase or that you're going to recommend you to friends, etc. And so people move from that into what's called the Net Promoter Score, which Net Promoter is the concept of it's a single question. Would you recommend, well, how likely is it that you would recommend our company to your friends and neighbors? And so people took a look at that, and there's a formula that people use, 10-point scale, take the top two categories, number of responses there, and subtract the number of responses in the first 5 categories, and that's your NPS score. And people were tracking that for a while and thinking that that's a way to do it. But there's something moving beyond that now. 2 years ago, people started doing research, and what they're finding increasingly is that in many industries, not all, many industries, what's really important is customer effort. How hard is it to do something? There's some work that was, oops, I'm getting ahead of myself, I guess. Let me go to this other chart. So these measures of customer engagement basically looked at these various measures. Oops, darn it, I'm sorry, I'm good. Too many buttons on this little device. So predictive power for repurchasing, how likely is it that you will repurchase something, and predictive power for how much more you will spend, because these are sort of two critical factors for a lot of organizations. And here was sort of customer satisfaction, net promoter, and customer effort. And so we're seeing some really interesting trends here in how people are doing this. How's this important to you? Well, I think as you're designing system solutions, for those of you that are building these things, you really need to figure out, how do I build in mechanisms to track some of these kinds of metrics and tie it back into what's going on the agent side. So that's one thing that we've seen a lot of impact in. This chart is something that was put together by MetricNet. I think it's a very interesting summary of sort of the major key performance indicators. Doggone it. Key performance indicators for this. And so there are a couple of key measures here, the ones in red that they're looking at. And what this chart, I think, is really helpful showing is just what are the factors that go into building some of these kinds of metric solutions. So cost per contact, for instance, is made up of agent utilization, obviously. It's how many FTEs, what your absenteeism is and turnover. So it just sort of summarizes, I think, a lot of these kinds of interactions and how they can work. So take a look at something like this, again, if you're either building systems or else designing something for your own environment. A lot of interesting new stuff going on. Okay, moving into some of the other trend areas, there's some interesting new ideas coming into play. Workflow within call centers is a real interesting challenge, and we're starting to see some companies now build capabilities specific to track workflow or to help in the workflow and processing of how these systems work. And so that's an interesting concept that, again, I think we're going to start seeing more and more companies try to get into. How do we build workflow capabilities directly into the way the contact center works? Obviously, one of the key issues is information about the customer and how do you display this. And what's critical here is typically interacting with other solutions. So how do I get access to something in a CRM system or contact history capability? So having tools available that allow you to go outside into some of these other adjunct systems that the company might have is going to be really important. I think one of the nice things about Microsoft and their positioning is, again, as a platform concept, they have tools available that will allow you to build links, if I can use that word, into other systems and solutions. And so pulling this information about a customer based on the ANI number, the number that they called in from on the phone system, that kind of thing is going to be a very important and critical function as we're going on. So I think we're going to hear a little bit about how do we build some of those things in. Some of the partners do it directly from their own systems because they've built all these hooks prior. Others are leveraging some of the Microsoft capabilities to go out and do that as well. We're going beyond sort of contact history things. We're starting to look at predicting next action. This is a very interesting concept within organizations, because what we're trying to do now is have an idea of what the problem currently is. So if we go out to a database and understand that this particular customer has called us 3 times on a service problem in the last week, that may change how you want to route that call. And so that kind of thing is helpful. You'll hear this in the airlines, for example. When I call up, say, American Airlines, they recognize who I am. They look up the fact that I've got travel scheduled for this afternoon. And so they ask me, hi, Donald, we see that, you're flying today. Would you like help with that reservation? They try to predict what my next action might be. And so those kinds of capabilities that are being built into contact center environments are significantly changing the perception of how customers are interacting with the company. Finally, let's look at agent assistance issues. Screen pops have been around for a long time, where the agent gets a call in, and as the call is arriving at the agent station, the desktop shows up with all the information about that particular customer. This is just sort of a table stakes, I think, for most of today's contact centers. You simply have to have that capability to reach out and pull back this kind of information. But increasingly, we're starting to see it linked into other capabilities as well. Knowledge management is a really good example. I think that we're starting to see there's so much information out there, and figuring out ways to better pull that into our agent environment. That's sort of a really key piece. And finally, reaching experts. I'm going to, on the next slide, I'm going to be talking more about sort of unified communications capabilities. One of them, obviously, is how do we use things like IM and presence to identify individuals who might be out somewhere in the organization, or maybe experts even inside the call center who can provide assistance to us right now in order to sort of improve first call resolution, for example. Key concept for, again, how do we interact with customers. So some others, outbound. There are two flavors of outbound. One is telemarketing, calling you up and seeing if you need any new storm windows at dinner time, typically. But beyond that, what we're increasingly seeing is the ability for a contact center to proactively outbound either calls or text messages or some sort of information going out to the customer. For what purpose? To alleviate phone calls coming in. The best way to cut your costs in your contact center is to eliminate the calls. And a good way to eliminate the calls is to let people know proactively when something's about to happen. The insurance check's in the mail, you're scheduled for an appointment at this particular time, here's the information that we are going to need when you come into your appointment. So that kind of proactive outbound notification we find can be an extremely helpful kind of a concept and capability. So think about building that into the capabilities you have within your solution. We've seen a lot of changes over the years in self-service. Obviously, speech recognition capabilities on top of IVR is something that a lot of companies are starting to go to, which, again, really improves certain kinds of interaction with customers. And I think what we're seeing is that it's expanded the way the telephone can be used, or voice communications can be used as a way to get information into the process. But beyond that, going into much more effective web services capabilities that will allow web interactions, and then from there have the ability to link back into the call center. So web chat functionality, for example, possibly with screen sharing or some kinds of methods there so that the agent can really interact with the customer on a more effective basis. All these things are starting to become very much more important. And finally, unified communications. This is, I think, a huge opportunity. Contact centers have traditionally been very isolated in terms of their positioning within the industry itself. Quite often they're off in a corner someplace, and they tend to think of themselves as being this little cost center, and they've got to try and minimize the costs, answer a large number of calls, et cetera. And what we're not doing a good job of, I think, is expanding the concept of what a contact center ought to be. So part of that is really bringing the appropriate expertise to a particular transaction so that it can be more effectively answered. Part of it is, really thinking beyond that into new ways that communications are likely to be flowing. But the point is that we've had some challenges getting presence-based expert finding systems deployed within centers. A lot of those are sort of operational and historical on the part of where contact center managers are coming from. But I think that, again, building in these capabilities is going to become increasingly important. And the reason is because we're starting to see the real need. Solving customer effort problems is all about getting the right information at the right time. And if that means that getting to an expert or somebody that can directly answer a very specific question, that's the way you really make a change in terms of how the customer views that interaction with the company. And so having those kinds of capabilities, I think, is going to be increasingly important going forward. Okay, let's talk about all the partner solutions. That was sort of about some of the big trend areas that we're seeing in the industry. If we start looking at how are people deploying it, I'm going to go back to this chart and just say the first thing, of course, is that Microsoft has, while they've chosen not to get into, let me say, the ACD business, they've certainly chosen to get into something that approaches some of this. So this whole response group functionality that they have is over here on the left-hand side, departmental solutions and fairly basic capabilities, but taking advantage of fairly straightforward, let me call them telephony functions to make it work. But even here, we're starting to see some companies that are building very specific systems on top of it. One of the weaknesses in this response group area is some of the metrics and reporting stuff. And so as a result, we've got companies, partners that are in here and developing specific solutions for this. As we go further with this, though, we're seeing that the partner solutions span the rest of this space very nicely. We've got some systems that are really very high-end. Quite often they're independent companies that have developed their own solutions. We'll hear from a couple of them in a few minutes. They've got their own solutions that work very effectively. Other companies are maybe new, kids on the block that are just starting to put some new solutions together that take advantage of some of the Microsoft platform capabilities. So we're seeing a real span in terms of functionality and market sizes and things that these things are designed for. These are just some of the representative partners that are here. Many of them are here. We're here on the show floor. So I hope all of you got a good chance to look at some of these kinds of companies. These are all contact center partners that provide different kinds of contact center solutions. There's also a group of what I'll call adjunct solution providers that do not so much an entire contact center typically, but more specific pieces within the contact center functionality. So we're seeing a lot of companies that are here. And again, I hope all of you that are in the market looking at this were able to get onto the show floor and see what they're doing. Lync, of course, has developed an ISV qualification test plan. This is an incredibly comprehensive set of capabilities. I'm sure most of you are ISVs in the room, and so I'm sure you know very well about this particular document and how that works. But what it's done is it's really I think given people a stringent set of tests that they have to demonstrate their ability to meet specific kinds of outcomes. So good job here. All right, what that means if we start looking at all these partner solutions is that there's a pretty broad spectrum from very formal call centers off on the right-hand side of that chart to sort of informal or departmental kinds of solutions. There's a wide range in terms of number of agents supported. Some of the partners are really focused on kind of the small end of the market, 20 to 30 agents or so as a maximum. Others, they're literally unlimited. It's just basically how they architect their solution, adding additional servers to get into the thousands of agents that can be supported on top of a Lync platform. The functionality, wide range of capabilities. Some of them are extraordinarily fully functioned, fully featured. Others have very focused capabilities, very limited perhaps in their extent. And again, it all depends on what's required in your business. We'll talk a little bit more about that as a concept a little later. And finally, how do we internetwork with Lync? And we're going to come and spend some time. I'm going to ask the partners that are coming up to talk a little bit about one of the two fundamental ways that this is being done. Either you're connected to Lync, or else you're actually writing native code right inside of the Lync framework. And there are advantages and disadvantages of either of those kinds of approaches. What's sort of interesting as we look at this in general is that there seems to be a pattern of the solution providers. Again, and I'm arraying it sort of number of agents on the vertical axis and feature richness and complexity going across the bottom. And what I find is that the established contact center solution providers, Genesys, Aspect, Interactive Intelligence, companies like this, tend to be up in this kind of area. Whereas some of the newer players, newer solution providers, this is all generalization, clearly, but they tend to be in this part of the area, probably a little less feature rich in many cases, or typically don't tend to go after the larger number of agents. Again, this is a very generalized statement. The other tendency is this, that those companies in the sort of blue section, the established contact center providers, tend to use more connected, what I'll call the connected solution approach, whereas some of these newer companies tend to be more involved in sort of a native connection interaction. Again, we'll come back and talk about that through the alternatives that we have. So I've got sort of 4 companies that are going to come up and talk for a few minutes each about where these things are. Computer Talk, Regia will be up, Genesys, Livio is going to be with us, Interactive Intelligence, Brad, and then finally Robin from Workstream People with their Anywhere 365 product. So let's get started. Let me just turn this on for you, Regia. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you. Use your clicker, right button.
Okay, so my name is Regia Arinosi. I'm a VP in charge of alliances here at Computer Talk. I apologize about my voice, but you know, Vegas has been obviously a great place to party, and I lost my voice on the way, so I apologize, but I'll try to be as enthused. My goal here really is to introduce you for a few minutes and talk about why native versus connected is important for us as a provider. So really what I want to show you here quickly is the architecture that we have decided to go Computer Talk. We're one of those companies that have decided to go to the native route. For us, really being in the business for about 25 years, mostly in Canada and then slowly in the US, from what we've heard from customer really is the contact center is a very complex matter. It's not an easy matter. It's pretty strategic for organizations. And when we've been investing resources into looking at Lync, that was back in the OCS days, it was clear to us that a lot of customers actually wanted something that was actually pretty easy to use and easy to integrate. Hence, for us, really, the first criteria in order for us to compete against those companies that we talked about really was to be able to come to the native way. So for us, we made the decision to really leverage the Lync enterprise, the Lync front-end pool, and leverage the Lync mediation server. So the reason why you see here ICE being behind the PBX is because we're actually leveraging the Lync mediation server. This gives us a couple of advantages. The first advantage really is what we call interoperability. It's important for customers today to be able to see and leverage the investment that they made into Lync. So anything that Lync can see, ICE can actually reach. We're talking here about federation, so Skype. Anything that, if a customer has enterprise voice or a customer has a Lync certified PBX, ICE will actually be able to see that Lync certified PBX quite easily. So again, coming back to that notion of ease of use really has been important. All of the modalities that customers are looking at, starting with IM and presence back in the old days, and then more and more, lots of customers moving on to enterprise voice, it's pretty easy to actually, once you're native, it's pretty easy to include the rest of the Lync modalities into your contact center. So Lync contact center modalities are supported directly. Devices. Lots of customers today want to make sure that their devices are fully integrated and work seamlessly with a contact center. That's exactly what the interoperability is actually bringing onto the contact center. Finally, when it comes to working with partners to implement a Lync solution, there's no need for extra trunks, gateways, routing. We actually leverage all of that, and that's the beauty of also being a native. Is there's basically we're using the exact same thing that is actually going to be used here. It's the same SPC that the customer is going to be using. It's going to be it's part of their Lync topology. The call actually stays within Lync and has never been passed on to a different application. And then finally, we have a lot of customers who actually want to do a POC, obviously, because there's still some people that are a little afraid and want to make sure that it works. So for us, it really helps to be able to work them through migrations and have them, whenever they're ready, to start with the IM and presence first and then move on to Lync Enterprise Voice and gives them the ability to really go with their own pace. Lync actually has a certain amount of resources that are built in that really translates into lots of savings. At the end of the day, the customer has to pay for it. The fact that we have built-in automatic speech recognition, text-to-speech, and the host media processing at no extra cost really comes down to the bottom line, and obviously is appreciated by customer. And then finally, Lync presence. Anything, we're basically bringing all the presence capabilities that Lync has, and with customers who have very large Microsoft tools who want them to be integrated with their contact center, we're bringing the presence all in the organization. Any questions, please come and see us at our booth. It's on the booth downstairs, 618. I can be here as well after if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Livio Pugliese. I am a Senior Program Manager at Genesys, and I'm responsible for everything Lync, all the integration of Genesys with Lync. So I won't go through this. It's only for you to read if you want. And it's just a brief company introduction. So Genesys obviously has a pretty big install base, and we have basically two types of customers. We have customers who are already on Genesys and are looking into migrated to Lync, and customers, prospects who are maybe already deploying Lync, possibly Lync Voice, and are looking to get a contact center, of course. So at the moment, our integration is done through our SIP server, which is clearly a trunking SIP integration, and fits either in front or behind the Lync front-end pool in order first to get calls, stay in the path of the call as a basically back-to-back user agent, and this way manage the call in conjunction with Lync. So in this slide you can see that the call may come in from a SIP or from the PSTN. If it's a call to the contact center, the gateway is possibly able to do some routing. So if the call is to the contact center, to a customer service number, goes to our SIP server, that then manages the call, finds an agent, routes the call in conjunction with the rest of the Genesys environment, and sends the call to the agent through Lync mediation server and front-end server, of course. This is all very good. We also have some working with the Lync client on the desktop, integration there. And we see the presence of everyone who is also provisioned into Genesis through, we call that UC connector. It's something that goes directly to the Lync front end and gets the presence information from users there. So we're able to use that. Also to contact experts in the rest of the enterprise, as Don was saying, in order to in order to find to categorize experts by the skills and route information, route interaction not only to individual people but to skill groups as well. Right. Now, we are also, for the moment, as I said, we're SIP-based, but we have started a project to also go with a native integration, because we recognize that there are advantages to both, and there are maybe some limits of what SIP trunking can do with Lync. And so, going to the next slide, if I can do that. There we go. Okay, so both approaches have benefits, of course. One thing of SIP-based integration is that it supports voice, presence, and IM today. It has difficulties supporting video. The reason is that going through the mediation server strips out all the video-related headers. And so if there is a video interaction coming from outside the company, you don't see it. Clearly, SIP has a benefit of being standard-based. It's easier for external integration. And the SIP server for Genesis has a very good track record. I think we have something like about 500,000 seats out of it. It's very, very stable and reliable, 5 nines, and so it's clearly a rock-solid platform, and guarantees the full support of the Genesis suite as well. UCMA integration, which will be available, well, I'll say soon, but this year. Well, as we said, in this case, all the Lync features are reachable. So video will be reachable. Management of hard phones natively through UCMA. Native IM and presence and collaboration, Skype integration, and things like that. But regarding video, I was just, I thought about I would relate this little thing. I was talking with a customer, a big bank in Germany, about maybe a year and a half ago. And they said, yeah, we're doing video. We're starting, and we're very happy about it. We are going to double our seats number from 4 to 8 next year. And so, if we think about SIP and about what it can do, video is not in its prime yet. But if you think about the integration that you can do with Lync, and the integration with Skype, then it becomes really a must-have, because this is possibly a discontinuity point. And this is why, also one of the reasons why we decided to go with a native integration for the next release. And we're going to support both, actually. So anyways, in both cases, we'll be enabled the full Genesis suite through using Lync as the voice infrastructure, and as we say now, universal communication infrastructure, right? Which means for complex and large size contact center through the Genesis Enterprise Edition, and going to lower number of seats, medium size, with the Genesis Business Edition. And clearly, everything that Genesis support will be also supported by Lync. I think that's basically. Sure.
Okay, Brad?
Okay. Hello, my name is Brad Forsyth from Interactive Intelligence. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but we went with the approach of the connected integration. And you'll notice up here we're kind of seeing if I can, is the pointer in the top one? Okay. So over here towards the left, you're going to see the CIC server and the media server. Essentially, all of the applications that run from Interactive Intelligence, and the actual name of the product is Customer Interaction Center, all runs on one server. So it literally is an application server, and then our media servers really handle the heavy lifting, right? So audio, recordings, prompt plays, things like that. And then you're using a UCMA integration to handle an integration to Lync with presence. What this is really showing here is in your organization, you could have Lync users, and that's all they're using. You could have CIC users, where they're actually using the built-in PBX inside of CIC. Or you could have, like, contact center agents who might be using Lync and CIC together, just what I would refer as a combo user. It really doesn't matter to us what kind of a user they are, because what we're doing is when the call comes in, we're actually receiving that call, and then we're just delivering it to that person's endpoint. So once we decide where that call needs to go, if it's a Lync endpoint, great, we send it to the Lync phone. If they're using a phone that's actually configured inside of our administrator, like an IP phone from Polycom, it's going to go to that endpoint. So for us, it doesn't really matter. Let me go ahead and go to the next slide. Just a few points here. It says no rip and replace. What that means is we have a lot of customers who have many different needs, and a lot of times, depending on the industry that they're in, may determine what the architecture is going to look like. Some are very heavily, have a lot of compliance standards that they have to maintain. And so with our integration to Lync, it actually helps us to avoid any kind of rip and replace projects, because we can just continue to write on top of Lync. That's essentially what our solution's doing. It's just writing on top of Lync for the telephony. Let's see here. I know you guys can read this yourself as well, but I'll just kind of touch some of the highlights here. Breadth of contact center solution. What that means is that we can still, even with using Lync as the telephony layer, we can still perform the work that we've always been doing, like workforce optimization, recording of all calls, recording of all media types actually, and even screen recording, scorecarding for quality management, outbound dialer. It does have an outbound dialer called Interaction Dialer that handles some very sophisticated dialing strategies like predictive dialing and everything. Let's see, enterprise. So just a quick advertisement there for Interactive. Over 6,000 customers worldwide. I think we actually have about 19,000 Lync seats. So of all the customers that are integrated with Lync, they actually make up about 19,000 seats using Lync. Okay.
And Robin?
Hi, everybody. My name is Robin van der Breggen. I'm the Business Development Director for Workstream People, the Netherlands. Thank you to my previous speakers. Great presentations. Great to be here. Thanks, Don, for inviting me. Yeah, we take a little bit sort of a disruptive approach to contact centers. Don was saying that we have these contact centers. Those are those little cost centers somewhere far away. We actually try to bring it back to the business again. So what we actually do is we do in dialogue management. And what that means is actually that we try to help organizations improving the customer journey of their customer. So just imagine, I had an issue with the tax department recently. I had to call them for a couple of times over the past couple of weeks. Always spoke to a different person. I always had to repeat my story again. Nothing was written down, no access to my information. Then I sent them an email, and it was completely handled by another department. So no transparency of the whole process flow. So what we actually do with our approach is that we actually say that it doesn't really matter how you contact the organization, if it's by email, Twitter, chat, web chat, call. you will always get in contact with the right person, of the right department, with the right level of expertise, and access to your information. And how we do that is actually through our vision of Rethink Contact Center. So you're not limited by any device or location where you work. We will make that possible. And how we do that is actually through the way we set up the software. It's done through UCCs, which stands for Unified Contact Center. And a Unified Contact Center, that can be a department, for example, IT, support, or finance department. It can also be a role model, for example, the reception or boss admin. It can be internal, but it can also be external. Just imagine if you work together with a company in your value chain and a call needs to be transferred through to that domain. Normally, you will lose the connection and see what happens. Well, we'll make that visible in our management information as well. What we add to the functionalities of Lync in your business is that we actually make the proposition stronger. So we offer contact center solution, we offer a reception attendant, we offer CRM integration, we offer skill-based routing, and we actually replace response groups. So all these issues that you have with response groups are basically solved with Anywhere 365. Now, just to show you how we do that, and then we need the other. Is it in here as well? Okay, this one. Okay. So what you see actually is that everything runs within the Lync topology. What you also see is that we don't have Active Directory users, but we have SIP address users. So everybody with the SIP address can be an agent. So it doesn't matter where you are, what kind of device you use. Through your mobile, having your Lync client on your mobile, you having a SIP address, you can be part of the solution. The smallest footprint that you will have with Anywhere 365 is SharePoint Foundation and SQL Express, and one Anywhere 365 server running in one location. And as you can see, we're also part of, say, the trusted application pool. That means actually that we can have up to 12 Anywhere 365 servers running in one pool, actually creating unknown scalability advantages. And that's all done through the topology builder in Lync. You see that all the normal communication still runs within Lync. So we have the standard telephony is done through mediation. We have the communication with the outside world is done through the edge server. And all the normal communication is done through the front-end server. What we see here is that we have a service bus that makes all these functionalities possible within the Anywhere 365 overview. We use SQL to actually store all the big data of all the metadata of all the dialogues from all these channels. We use IaaS for web chat, web services, and we use SharePoint to actually organize the settings within the UCCs and for the IVR content. And then on top of that, you basically have the contact with the outside world, and you offer all the management information that we have real time to our SharePoint portal that we have in here. And we basically offer that on-premise in the cloud in Office 365, and we also federate with Skype users. Thank you.
That was great. Okay, and while we're at it, let me just take a moment to introduce Lars and Renee from Lync, Denmark. They're also here, and as I say, we have a number of different suppliers that have been here with us this week. It's really been great. Okay, so how do we choose? And there aren't too many end users within the organization. This is largely directed to them, but for those of you that are developers, some things to think about, I think, in terms of how do we frame contact center solutions within an organization. This is based on some work that my Vanguard company has done over the last couple of decades in terms of what we're seeing and how we see this going forward. Because fundamentally, choosing a platform and choosing an approach to developing a solution really is based on what you're trying to do within the center. It all goes back to what's the business goals and the business objectives. And I think that that's something that is going to become even more important going forward. This is a model that we've used for a long time. It's based on some seminal work that was done back in the mid-'80s Tracy and Wordsma wrote a book called The Discipline of Market Leaders. And basically their thesis was that companies that are going to be effective need to make a choice as to what value discipline they're going to be promoting within their organization. What is it that drives the entire company in terms of how they differentiate themselves and how they achieve value? Are they customer intimate? Do they excel in product leadership? Or is there a focus on operational efficiency? And we can see that there are a number of, here's some example companies that follow one of those various threads. Apple, Nordstrom's, Walmart. They have different business models and different ways that they go about differentiating themselves. And the important point for this discussion is that has some implications for how you run a contact center, how you want to interact with your customer base. So for example, it's pretty obvious if you're a Nordstrom's, if you're really looking at customer intimacy, having detailed knowledge of each customer's relationship and the history with the company and what they ordered last time and all this sort of thing, this can be an extremely helpful piece of information. Well, that implies some information about, or some characteristics about what this system has to do, what capabilities it has to have to dig into customer databases or understand even previous purchase behavior. And so the point is that if this is your goal, then it means that your interaction center is going to be working in a certain way. On the other hand, if your focus is like Walmart on operational efficiency, then again, the requirements for the contact center can be quite different. And I think that it's, I'm not going to read all these, but basically it's quite a different set of capabilities to what you have from Nordstrom's or from an Apple. Product leadership is sort of an interesting issue from a contact center standpoint. If that's really your goal, what do you do? And one of the really interesting things is how companies like Apple that are in this kind of a category frequently will use their contact center agents as a way to mine information from customers. What do we hear about what our competitors are doing? What do we hear about product innovations that we should be thinking about for our own system? And so, again, all of these things mean you have a quite different kind of functionality or capability that's going to be important. And so I think this is something to be thinking about for your own business as you're going forward and trying to think about where are we taking our, what product should we buy to support our contact center. It's really highly dependent, or it should be highly dependent on what's your business and how do you relate to it. Here's another model that we have that also gets to this point. We think it's really critical for contact centers to mirror what the overall capabilities are of the corporation. So, So the center mission, the mission of the center, really needs to be consistent with what I talked about in that previous slide. Where does it array? And then that implies some different kind of center capabilities out here. And the point is that different capabilities in your contact center will be appropriate depending on what that mission is. Where we see in our consulting work, where we see companies getting into trouble is if you have a contact center manager or somebody responsible for the contact center capabilities, and they think, gee, we really want to get out here and be on the leading edge. We want to, have, integrated multimedia queuing capabilities and really deep capabilities to reach into customer history, and yet their corporate strategy isn't about that at all. Their corporate strategy means that the contact center, ought to be working on an operationally efficient approach. And so the point is, it's really key to kind of marry these things up. But what it does imply is, and by the way, this is a pretty generalized list down at the bottom, but it implies certain kinds of functionality that you're going to require. And obviously, depending on the functionality required, that implies what kind of vendors can best meet that solution. And so that's how all of this sort of ties together in here. And what we're finding is that increasingly companies that do a good job of pulling this sort of thing together, we find have much more success over the long term. So where are things going in the future? I've talked before about sort of some of the trends and some of the key things we see coming in the industry and why that has impact on features and functionality that the vendors need to be building into their solutions. Here's some more things going forward. I think we talked about multi-channel, and there are kind of two dimensions of this. One is that someday I might, call up, have a voice conversation with someplace. Another time I'm going onto the website and trying to interact that way. But what's really interesting and what I think is going to happen a lot more is that we're going to be seamless across channels, and that people will start out in one and then migrate to another. We're already seeing that, obviously, website to web chat, and possibly even escalating that to a telephone call. And these kinds of capabilities, if you look at the new generation of kids that are coming along, they're very used to that fluid kind of approach to communications. And so I think that mirroring that in our contact centers is going to be increasingly important. Partial automation. It's really interesting. What we often find when we're talking to companies about their contact center environment is they tend to take an all or nothing approach to many things. So for example, I'm going to put in a real fancy slicked IVR system, and so I want to have all my customers do all of their interaction and transactions through this IVR. And we want them to complete all of those in the IVR. Total self-service. Get rid of the phone call. Quite often that's a terrible idea. And yet a really good idea is, but on the other hand, if we have them just call in on a voice call, we have the agents doing a lot of fairly generic, routine information gathering. Well, the obvious answer is marry those two together. So use the IVR system as a way to extract information that can easily be gathered, that's non-ambiguous, and then pass the call with all that information, by the way, to the agent, who can then help with some of the subtlety things, the nuances, or, well, here's why this particular program would be better than this particular program, which meets your situation better, Mr. Customer. So I think that kind of a concept is something that's going to become increasingly important going forward. What's the implication from a development standpoint? How do we get a hold of some of those informations? The ability to build on top of a Microsoft platform, for instance, or to use your capabilities to dive into databases that have APIs or ways that you can get into some of the other information that's on the corporate system, I think is going to be very critical and increasingly important. Smartphone integration, we talked a little bit about that before. The fact that, it's not just somebody who's using their smartphone as a communications device, it's the fact that we can now do things like visual menus, for interactive voice response systems. So the fact that we can use mobile apps to really do a lot of this work, but then link back to the contact center and transfer the call along with all the information from the agents directly. And then finally, let me bring up a new kind of a concept that I think is going to become increasingly important going forward. I think the contact center is potentially, we're going to see more and more end runs around it. What's going to happen is that we're starting to develop customer portals, a place where customers can log on to a system, authenticate themselves, and so it's a secure environment. And in that sort of a context, they not only can get information that's pertinent to their own situation, I see where my insurance claim is as I'm going through this process, but they can also see the presence of individuals that they might be interacting with. Not somebody in the contact center, but that expert that's really out in the field, the specialist that they've been working on, to keep the insurance analogy going, the insurance adjuster themselves, so that they have direct connection right to those kinds of individuals. That sort of bypasses the contact center in a traditional sense. And I think, frankly, some of the things that Robin was talking about offer up some interesting capabilities in this area where you're really starting to think of the company as the contact center itself. And for certain kinds of environments, I think that's a very interesting and a very powerful thing going forward. So the ability to have these single points where the organization can really work effectively to bring these new capabilities to the contact center is critically important. And my point is that I think what's going to be interesting in the next 5 years is we're going to see emerge more and more systems integrators, software developers, specialist companies that are going to really develop very unique capabilities for customer interactions. And the ability to build on top of a platform, that is fairly generic, like Microsoft, and they're not the only one. There are others that are out here and available. But the point is, this is really going to change, I think, how these solutions are offered in the future. So just in summary, I think we've talked about a lot of these things. All of it starts with a business strategy. And I think from an end user, those of you that are thinking about where do we go next, what do we deploy, beginning there, having a vision for how communications works. Again, go back to my early slide. This is fundamentally changing. I mean, the whole notion of how we used to do voice communications is out the window. And so I think that it's crucial to have that vision in place, plan the architecture around where you can develop it and how you can go, and then work out an implementation plan. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. We have a few minutes for questions. If any of you have questions either for me or for any of Livio or Robin or Roger or who else? Robin? Brad. There you are. How you doing? How's that voice? Any questions? Okay, good. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate your being here, and it's been wonderful. Thanks.